right, campers. So let's talk about seam allowances. We're ready to do the second type of exporting from CLO, which is to create an actual muslin. And so I've got a pattern here that I kind of worked on a little bit. I gave her an ampere waist and a little bit wider flow of the garment. But it doesn't matter. For any garment, the seam allowances are going to be the same. So let's talk about how we put seam allowances in. Seam allowances are in the 2D window. So you're going to work primarily in the 2D window here. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to give myself some extra room by dragging that middle bar over to give me lots of room in the 2D window. And then I'm going to find the seam allowance tool. And the seam allowance tool is here. Again, if you can't remember which one's which, just mouse over and it will show you seam allowance. And I'll click on it for seam allowances. All right. So now I've got a bunch of dots, and this looks a lot like the pattern editing tool. And it's very, very similar to the pattern editing tool. So let's start with, I'm going to start with this piece over here on the right. Okay. And here's this long line down here. I want a seam allowance on this because I want to sew this piece to the front of the garment. So I'm just going to click, as I mouse over, you'll see that you get that blue line. I'm just going to click on it, and it's going to give me a seam allowance. And because this is a mirrored symmetrical pattern, it's going to give me a seam allowance on the other side too. All right, let's talk a little bit about the seam allowance. It only goes from this point to this point. That is the segment of line that I asked for a seam allowance on. And the default over here, 0.394, is about 3/8 of an inch, so it's an extremely narrow margin, seam allowance. I'm immediately going to change that from 0.394 to 0.625, which is more like the 5/8 seam allowance that we're used to. As a matter of fact, sometimes in CLO, I'll give it a full inch seam allowance, and that'll help me size things when it gets on the mannequin. So I'll make the muslin and then I'll adjust the size, a little bit using the seam allowance. And then when I'm done there, I'll put some marks on it and use it to cut the finished pattern. Okay, so there's, excuse me, a 5/8 inch seam allowance. All right. I want that on some other segments too. So here's another one, and you notice it's back to the 394, 625, right? And then maybe I want it on the shoulder, 394.625, and you notice again it only picked up half the shoulder because there's a dividing mark in that shoulder. So I have to pick up this little segment here. Let's zoom in. There we go. Click on that little segment and change that one to 0.625. And if this seems like it's a lot of work and it's very tedious, you're absolutely right, it is. So let's talk about how we can make it a little bit more smooth. Okay, this middle unit here, okay, this middle seam here, I'm going to want to seam allowance that. Oops, I clicked on it and I didn't want to. Let me take that off. There we go. I'm going to want to do this whole seam from the neckline all the way down to the hemline. Okay, if I look, it's divided into 4 segments. Segment 1, segment 2, segment 3, and you're like, well, where is segment 4? Well, segment 4 is in between these 2 tiny little marks here. There's segment 4. Okay, I don't want to do them all individually. So what I can do is I can click on one of them. I can hold down Shift and I can keep clicking, okay? And as I'm holding down the Shift key, I've got them all as one property, and if I change them all to 0.625, it should change all of them, and of course it doesn't, because darn you, it doesn't work for me. All right, well, it's annoying, but I should be able to get all of them at 0.625. All right, so now I have, looking at this garment, I have 5/8 inch seam allowances over every seam I'm going to sew together. You notice I haven't done the neckline or the armhole or the hem yet. So let's talk a little bit about those. Your 5/8 inch seam allowances are when you're sewing piece to piece. When you're doing necklines, hemlines, and armholes, you may have different openings or different wraparounds that you want to do. So for example, on the hem of the garment, I usually give myself a full inch down here, and that lets me fold up a 1/2 inch and a 1/2 inch again. So if I click on that bottom piece, I get that 0.394. Okay, let's make it 1 inch. There we go. I've got a 1-inch seam allowance just on the hemline. Okay, so that'll let me fold up half and half. If I would like to do the 0.625, if I'd like to fold up 5/8 and 5/8, that would be 1.25, right? And that'll let me fold up 5/8 and then 5/8 again. Okay, so that's my hemline. Okay, and it is important to keep that consistent across the garment. So if that's my hemline there, it needs to also be my hemline here. 1. What did I say it was? 25. There we go. Okay, so make sure you keep that consistent across the garment. My neck or my armhole over here, I want to be relatively thin. I'm going to go with, let's go with a plain old 5/8 seam allowance. 5/8. Let's do 6/8. Let's do a 3/4 there. Okay, and then that'll let me fold over and then fold over again without putting a lot of bulk in this armhole, because I really don't want to do that. I don't want a lot of bulk there. And I'll do the same thing with the neckline up here. What did I say this one was? This one was 0.750. All right, let's do the same thing up here, 0.750. And then now I have a wider seam allowance here for this neckline. Okay, is it perfect? No. Will it work for me as a professional to put together this garment? Absolutely. Absolutely. This will work just fine. There are some things we can do with intersections. So we can change, for example, if I change the intersection, you notice I made the type of pullback. So now it's going to give me 1 seam allowance on this side and 1 seam allowance on that side. I can do that at every intersection here. So I pick this intersection and I choose the drop down and I can choose that. Okay, so now it's giving me completely separate, or I can choose fold arounds. Where's the other one that is, most of them are pretty similar. You just pick your straight out point. Usually this one is the one that you're going to go with. You're going to do that intersection in that direction. When you have internal pieces like this, it'll figure it out. It'll figure out the directionality for you. So that's kind of nice. And then we can go down to the bottom of our garment. Keep scrolling. There we are. We could take that intersection and we can pick that one right there. Intersection, broken intersection. All right, now I have seam allowances on these 2 pieces that look pretty good, and I like those. And that's how you get seam allowances on your garment. And yes, when you print it, those will print with the seam allowances on them. And it's up to you to create instructions for how to deal with that pattern. Okay?